Hello, everyone. In this presentation, I will be speaking about the short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Here is a pretty significant quote from the story to lead us into this discussion, and it goes, "Do you believe in bobbed hair?" asked G. Reese in the same undertone. "I think it's unmoral," affirmed Bernice gravely, "but of course you've either got to amuse people or feed 'em or shock 'em." Now, I feel like this quote is really indicative of the story as a whole, as it already sets up the themes of social constructs, femininity, and the hair as a major symbol, and this focus on morality as well. Now, before we get into the story itself, I think it's important to give you some background on the author F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was born in 1896 and died in 1940. Interestingly enough, he was named after the famous Francis Scott Key, who we know wrote the poem that inspired the Star Spangled Banner that we sing today. Fitzgerald attended Princeton but dropped out in 1917 to join the Army during World War I. When he was stationed in Alabama, he would meet his future wife, Zelda. Now, theirs was a very interesting relationship as they truly seemed to embody this particular era. They would attend lavish parties. Zelda was said to be a remarkably intellectual woman of her time. However, just as their lifestyle represented the glories of this time period, they also represented the tragedies so prevalent in his works, as they struggled with financial issues and Zelda had mental health problems throughout their marriage as well. Fitzgerald was also known as the chronicler of the Jazz Age because of his ability to praise but also largely critique the shifting transformative era. And his works largely reflected these glittering highs and tragic lows. Try to think of Great Gatsby, how Gatsby himself was rich and highly renowned in society, but still felt internally hollow and unfulfilled. So you can also find this theme in Bernice Bobs Her Hair as you read through it. All right, now let's discuss the background and a very brief summary of the story itself. So, this was first published by Fitzgerald in the Saturday Evening Post in 1920, was then later published in a collection of Fitzgerald's works entitled Tales from the Jazz Age. In the story, you can find themes like social expectations. If you notice the interactions of Bernice and Marjorie at their parties, transformation, as you can see through Bernice's gradual or maybe quite sudden shift from being traditional to more modern and, indicative of the flapper women of this time. And revenge. Obviously, this is seen through what Bernice does to Marjorie by the end of the story. The main characters are, of course, Bernice. She is the traditional, kind of low to middle class person in the story. She represents traditional woman. Marjorie represents the more radical new woman of the 1920s, and Warren is, of course, the love interest. So the story begins with Bernice coming to live with her cousin Marjorie for a time. Marjorie soon realizes that Bernice's mannerisms, characteristics, and appearance are all very dated, very traditional. So Marjorie attempts to kind of mold and shape Bernice into a new woman of the jazz age like her. Essentially, Marjorie tricks Bernice into bobbing her hair, and then Bernice gets her revenge on Marjorie by the end of the story. Now let's get into some themes from this story. First, you have social conformity versus individuality. You can kind of see this in how both Marjorie and Bernice end up conforming to society's expectations of them rather than allowing themselves to organically be who they actually are meant to be. You can see this especially when they start quoting different stories or different people, like when Bernice talks about Little Women or Marjorie quotes something from Wild. It's almost like they're taking pieces of other people from the past or from people from society and kind of building themselves with those pieces. Second is feminine power and manipulation. Here we can kind of get into how Fitzgerald might be viewing these new emerging flapper women of the 1920s. He's showing them as powerful and dangerous and exciting, but also kind of detestable. So, this theme becomes ambiguous in the story because Fitzgerald himself never really landed on a solid opinion on women at this time. Third, the role of appearance and social status. Of course, we can see this with the hair detailed throughout the story. We start with Bernice's and Marjorie's long, thick hair that they braid that inevitably ends up being cut radically shorter, which serves to transform their entire identity and status. Also, be sure to pay attention to the clothing and the dresses that they wear for parties. Fourth, youth and generational difference. Also, be sure to pay attention and notice to the interactions between Bernice and the adults in the story compared to Bernice and Marjorie and the people her own age. And fifth, of course, is Fitzgerald's critique of high society. So remember previously that we discussed how he portrayed the highs and lows of this time period, both admiration and admonishment at the same time. And this is really prevalent in this story too. Some key symbols in the story are, of course, the hair, representative of femininity, power, and identity. In the story, the bob almost takes on a character in its own right, as it really does represent all that tumultuous energy developing during the early and late 1920s. The mirror is another more subtle symbol for self perception and transformation. Scissors also play a big role. They serve as a metaphor for cutting ties and change. By cutting hair, Bernice's and Marjorie's, it represents a kind of untethering from Bernice and Marjorie from each other and from society itself. The train in the story could also serve as a symbol for departure and newfound independence. But as we'll talk about a little later in the presentation, and what you can already begin thinking about as you're reading through the story, maybe ask yourself, do any of the characters in the story ever really become free and independent, or are they stuck in a kind of societal trap? Also, while you're reading through the story, try and find some instances of irony because this story was written as a satire on women being forced to conform to beauty standards of this flapper culture. So, Fitzgerald most definitely includes irony to kind of expose the shallowness of these social pressures. The point of view of the story is from a close third person. What this means is you could see it as a fly on the shoulder type of concept. It's like the narrator is really, really close, can sometimes see into the minds of the characters, but mostly can focus on the details and the physical characteristics, the gestures, the faces that these characters make to really get you a well rounded viewpoint of the story. And of course, the setting, this is meant to be in the summer of 1920, and the story shifts to show Marjorie's very high upper class home, and a lot of the clubs and ballrooms and parties that they go to indicate this wealth and this status that these characters have. All right, so wrapping up this presentation, after reading the short story, just some questions to leave you with. Can you see the relevance of this story today? Can you see how it fits into the historical time period of the 1920s, particularly 1920? Or any themes or topics still important today? in the 2020s. Also, another burning question: did Bernice truly win in the end? Do you think she escaped from society, developed her own sense of agency and independence, and took off happily after she enacted her revenge? Or do you think that she's still inevitably trapped in a very transformative time period, kind of stuck in between trying to find herself while also trying to fit in? But that's just a thought. That concludes this presentation. Please complete the assignment that correlates and let me or your history professor know if you need any assistance or have any further questions.